horizons when it came to education and trying to learn a little bit more about it through an international lens. I also am the daughter of an immigrant and was curious about what schooling looked like overseas. I decided to apply for a Fulbright grant in Malaysia because it's a pretty diverse country. There are populations who are from a diaspora from China, from India, who are native Malaysian. And I was really interested in thinking about how all of those groups come together and form this country that incorporates religion into its government and has a different form of schooling. And so I was looking at some countries in Southeast Asia to apply to, but Malaysia really stuck out to me because of how incredibly diverse it is. And so that's how I landed on Malaysia. I taught at a secondary school in a small town called Gopeng. It's about 2 hours outside the capital. The capital is Kuala Lumpur. I did not know anybody before I started my Fulbright and met such wonderful peers when I was there, many of whom I'm still in contact with today. So I taught English mostly to students who were probably between the ages of 6 and 12. We also in Fulbright Malaysia had something called English camps, which maybe other Fulbrights have, but those were sort of day-long activities, afternoon-long activities that brought in ETAs from all over Malaysia to come on site and to really sort of get out of the classroom and have an interactive experience. So folks from around Malaysia put on camps that were about art or camps that were revolved around physical activity. And so my camp was, we went caving because the town that I lived in had some really, really cool historic caves. And so we learned a little bit about nature and a little bit about appreciating the natural resources around us, recycling, food waste. And I took 100 students caving along with fellow ETAs, including Michelle. And in addition, I started a young women's empowerment group where we talked about and did activities around a range of issues such as confidence, body image, and bullying, and other topics. And through these experiences, I really learned a lot about what it means to be a guest in another country, about what it means to have a deep appreciation and for the culture that you're in, what it means to learn from another culture and not just bring your thoughts into it, but actually be a really good listener. And I also learned a lot about myself, as I'm sure others who did a Fulbright did as well, because there were times that I was really uncomfortable and there were times that were really difficult and out of my comfort zone. So that is a little bit about my Fulbright. And Michelle, I think you're still on mute.
Thank you so much. Did you have any kind of big moments during Fulbright that were like career realizations for you or grad school realizations?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think when I was teaching, there were a lot of what seemed like these top-down mandates, right, in school. The fellow teachers at the school where I was in Malaysia spent so much of their time preparing for this end of year exam, which was really interesting to me. And additionally, it became very clear that the structures that were in place in Malaysia gave some students preference over other students. And so starting to think about what it means for school to be a vehicle for equity was a question that came up for me through my time in Malaysia and thinking about how racial dynamics really play out in classrooms and in school settings were questions that came up for me. Sorry, Michelle, I think you're on mute again.
Terima kasih. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your transition back after Fulbright, your transition home, and what you were, oh yeah, will you share your placement? Which part of Malaysia?
So I was in Gopeng, Malaysia, about 2 hours outside the capital, and about 40 minutes from a large city, Ipoh.
Cool, thank you. So yeah, your transition back, how that went, and then kind of what was your approach in terms of next steps and how you came to those and what they were. That would be great.
That sounds good. So my next steps, I want to take a moment to appreciate that coming back from Fulbright Malaysia to the US, as probably many of you can attest to, doing a Fulbright is such an incredible experience. It's an adrenaline rush. You're learning every day. You're doing something active every day, and it's pretty amazing. And I think upon returning to the US, there were parts that were really difficult, right? You go from having this incredible everyday experience to, okay, I'm back in the US and now I'm either looking at grad school or looking at jobs, and it just has a little bit of a different tone. So I want to just take a moment to appreciate that it can be a difficult transition, and appreciate how wonderful it was to keep in contact with many of my fellow Fulbrighters who were also going through similar transitions, and how much support I think we gave one another. So I knew that I wanted to stay in education when I returned to the US. I also knew that I really liked smaller environments and really liked working in small environments. And so I was sort of East Coast rooted and East Coast based. My family is from the East Coast, and many of my friends were there as well. And so I had a couple cities in mind, which I think is a really helpful first step in the career sort of search. Returning from a Fulbright is to, if you can, have an idea about maybe where you want to look. And as I mentioned, I wanted something that was a little bit smaller and focused on education. And so through a fellow Fulbrighter, I found a really wonderful organization called the National Academy for Advanced Teacher Education. And towards the end of our Fulbright experience, we had some career forums that were really helpful. There was nothing like this, which I really would have appreciated at the time, but we did have career forums to sort of like chat with each other and hear about each other's network. So a fellow Fulbrighter connected me to a small nonprofit in New York that focused on teacher professional development. And so I took a role there, and I really used a lot of what I learned on Fulbright during the interview process and the onboarding process. They wanted to hear about during my interview process with this team, they wanted to hear a lot about times that I had led teams, times that I had worked independently, times that I had worked in groups, times that I had worked in diverse environments. Those are questions that this particular organization asked me. And I would say those are interview questions that I've gotten at every stage of interviewing for various careers and jobs. And I really used a lot of what I learned from Fulbright. I talked about leading camps. I talked about planning camps alone. I talked about planning camps with my peers. I talked about times that were really difficult for me, and times when I made mistakes and learned from those mistakes. So those skills were quite transferable. Sorry, Michelle, I think you're on mute again.
Thanks. A bit more about your role and the organization and your experience there.
Definitely. So I was manager of program operations at this organization called the National Academy of Advanced Teacher Education, which is a mouthful. And the goal of the organization was to support current teachers in the US, particularly teachers who had been teaching for several years, but wanted ongoing professional development. Something that I learned about education in the US is that there are some really, really amazing teachers, but we're not as good in the US about providing them with all the supports that really help them thrive. And so this organization aimed to continue their education. And so I helped, my role was doing some program operations, which means helping to plan the programs, talking to teachers at schools, recruiting them for these programs, providing them with all the necessary information, and also going on site to these professional development opportunities that were 4 to 5 days long. Teachers came to a site and we hosted them for several days while providing this ongoing instruction. And I think for me, it was nice because I still got to interact with teachers, right? Something I think that's important to think about is the farther you're away in education from students and teachers, I think it can be hard if you're someone who's really passionate about education. And I knew I wanted to keep one hand kind of like on the pulse of schools and on the pulse of teachers. The name of that organization was the National Academy for Advanced Teacher Education. And so what was also really amazing about it is the people teaching the professional development classes were these content experts, right? These professors, these scholars in education. And so in addition to running the programs, I got to sit in on all the classes that these teachers were learning from, that these teachers were learning this amazing content from these experts. And that really piqued my interest, right? I wanted to learn, again, similar themes from Fulbright, learn more about education policy, who is making these rules, who is deciding what we teach in classrooms, who is deciding how schools are funded. These were all questions that came up that I didn't have the answer to. And I kind of knew that I wanted to learn a little bit more. But I'll also say that having work experience, in the US, I was starting to think about grad school as I was working there. And I really, really valued having worked for a year at the National Academy of Advanced Teacher Education, because I think having on the ground work experience just really opens up your eyes to the real realities facing teachers and educators and students in this country.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so that brings us to what happened post NATE. How'd you make those decisions? What were you looking for? And keep sending through questions, everyone, and we'll just circle back to most of them at the end. So definitely keep sending them through and know we will get to them. Thank you. But yes, what came after NATE for you?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I was around some really amazing teachers. I was around some really amazing sort of professors and scholars of education. And I realized that I wanted to learn more. I realized that there was so much that I didn't know about education. And so I started looking at graduate schools of education. I will also mention that, my Fulbright, again, was really, really a critical experience to my life. And international education was something that I was still interested in. And although my work experience was domestic education, it was still kind of in the back of my mind about how do we, or do I want to pursue a career path that's more focused on international education or domestic education? So I started looking at graduate schools of education, and many of them, I'll say, have both an international focus and a domestic focus. And you don't have to make the decision right away about which one you want to pursue if you're at all on the brink. So I looked at about 6 or 7 programs. And one thing that I did that I would encourage others to do is reach out and email at least 1 or 2 professors from each of these programs and mention that you did a Fulbright. I would send just a 2-line email because these professors were busy, and just sort of say, hi, my name is Sarah. I'm really interested in education policy and coming to XYZ school for a master's program. I currently work at XYZ and I recently completed a Fulbright in XYZ country. Do you have 20 minutes for an informational interview? most people said yes. And so that was something that was really, really helpful to me for getting to know more about the programs. And so that's one thing was, when deciding on a graduate school was emailing professors. Another thing was looking at the careers of graduates. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, which I think is actually totally fine when you enter grad school. That's what it's for, is helping you think about which specific career path you want. But I took a look at where the graduates, what kind of careers they were pursuing. I also took a look at the size of the program. I do think that in smaller programs in education, you get a little bit more individualized attention. There are more opportunities. And the last thing is I took a look at internship experiences. I think that one of the most, and maybe Michelle can attest to this too, one of the most helpful things that I got out of grad school, looking back at it now, was internship experiences. Because, and we can maybe touch upon this in a few minutes, but when you're applying to places, when you, after graduate school, when you're applying to jobs, they want to hear not only about what you learned in the classroom, but how did you actually apply it? What did you actually do in grad school outside of your coursework? So looking at internship experiences is also really, really helpful. And so I narrowed down my search to about 6 or 7 schools and ultimately applied to 6 or 7 schools. I reached out to professors during the application process. And so that was really, really helpful. I think another sort of technical aspect of this is I incorporated a lot of Fulbright into my personal statement. I was really open and honest about how Fulbright made me want to dive into education. And I was really sort of honest about all the things that I learned from Fulbright. I asked fellow Fulbrighters to take a look at my personal statement and provide edits. I asked anyone and everyone I could to take a look at my personal statement and give edits because, it's an important part of your application. As much feedback as you can get from anyone and everyone, from your next door neighbor to a professor you had in college, is really, really helpful because you want them to be sharp and to the point, I think was my takeaway from writing those. So anyway, so all that is to say, I applied to 6 or 7 schools and ultimately decided to pursue a degree from the Harvard Graduate School of Education with a focus on education policy. Most grad schools in education are 1 to 2 years. I don't think you'll find one that's more than 2 years. Mine was only 1 year, so it was quite fast. But it was a really, really wonderful experience.
Thank you. I think that is some very helpful, concrete advice on the grad school application process that I would absolutely agree with. And people had asked about that, so we can return to it later, but really great advice. So then after you finish your program, what came next and how'd you get to August 2020? What are you doing today? Tell us a bit about all of that.
Definitely. So, and I'll just say really quickly, in my program, I focused specifically on building statistical research skills, which I don't think is necessary, but I do think is really valuable in education. A lot of places I was looking at wanted to know that I could at least sort of read and process a research paper and kind of understand what was going on, which I think the statistics classes in grad schools of education help you do. I was also really scared of statistics, but it was a really, grad schools make it very attainable, so I appreciated that. So after school, I started a job at an organization called SRI Education. And it's a research organization. And so you'll find that there's, about a dozen, 2 dozen big names in education research in the US. I'll also mention that during grad school, I had decided to do sort of a domestic education policy focus. And so these education research organizations do project-based research that use, can you guys hear me? Maybe? Sorry, Michelle, I can't hear you.
I can still hear you, but I'm not sure about others. Maybe if you're having other audio.
Oh no.
Oh.
Uh-oh.
Maybe mute yourself and then unmute.
Okay, that sounds good. Oh no.
Thank you for flagging.
Yes, thank you. Still muffled?
Yeah, it's some bizarre. Are we getting the same feedback when I speak as well?
Gosh. Here, why don't I try calling in? Not just me.
Or maybe refreshing the window too.
Okay. All right.
Thanks all for flagging that. We'll see if we can get Sarah back with clear vocals, and I'm seeing the other questions.
How is this?
For me, that's crystal clear.
Better?
Awesome. Okay.
Okay, I can also speak closer to my mic. Maybe that's a part of the problem. I'll also say I'm in DC and we just had some crazy monsoon, so feels like I'm back in Malaysia a little bit.
2020, par for the course.
Yes,
Wouldn't
exactly.
be 2020 if it was a normal hour. Okay, thank you everyone, and carry on, Sarah.
Great. So education research organizations do project-based research and a variety of quantitative and qualitative work. So they are really the ones that are producing the firsthand research that I was using during grad school. And so, for example, some projects I worked on, we did an assessment of what California teachers are saying about their instructional materials for English language learners. So the instructional materials provided to them by California, were they helpful for their students? Were they not helpful for their students? We went in and collected quantitative data about student outcomes using different kinds of instructional materials, and conducted focus group interviews, qualitative interviews, things like that to get another perspective. And so that's one example of a project. Another example is we were funded by a foundation in Boston to examine sort of what is colloquially known as alternative schools, so schools that have off-track youth. What were really successful schools doing to engage these youth? So we went in and we interviewed students, we interviewed teachers of successful programs and successful schools, and gathered our findings so that we could apply these results more generally to the world and to other schools to use, so that, you know, someone in Kentucky could pick up this piece of research and say, oh, like this classroom in New York is using asynchronous learning. We can use that here in our classroom. So that's kind of what research, what the education research world is like. As I've gone through as in my career search, I've also found that in addition to the content of what you're doing, it's equally important to think about the work environment where you are and your peers and your colleagues and what the day-to-day is like, at least for me. So I just want to pause and say that education research also, I think culturally, is a little bit more of an independently driven workflow. You know, there were days where I was sort of working either on coding or writing up my findings, just sort of siloed. There are other collaborative opportunities, but it's pretty, if you're independently driven, and if you sort of enjoy longer term projects, this might be a really great field for you, because most projects last 3 to 5 years. That's how long these grants are. And so you come in and you could be at the end of a study where you're writing up findings, or you could be at the beginning of a study sort of helping to design surveys, et cetera. And so that's a little bit about education research. Personally, I really enjoyed and really loved my experience there. I was also at the same time a little bit moved just because of what was going on in the world. And sort of how I felt a need to be a little bit more action oriented. Education research can be a little bit slow. It's a slower pace because you're working on these long-term 5-year grants. And I felt like I wanted to do something a little bit action oriented. Quite honestly, I think I craved a little bit of that feeling that we had in Fulbright, being an ETA, of sort of doing something new and exciting every day. And so I transitioned. I briefly went to the Hill, which I'm happy to expand upon, but I was there for a short amount of time, so I won't say too much, but ultimately transitioned.
Sarah, can I just ask you, for those who might not be so DC centric, will you explain just briefly the Hill and what you, briefly. We can circle back if there are questions. But.
Definitely. Thank you, Michelle. So I did a fellowship in a congressional office in the House of Representatives. So I was working for my congressperson. His name is Jim Himes. He's a representative from Connecticut. And I was working, every congressperson has sort of a portfolio of issue areas that they work on. Health policy, security, and education is usually in there somewhere. So I was working on his education portfolio specifically. And so really, he was providing feedback on legislation that was drafted around education. And so I was there pretty briefly, but the working in the Senate or working in the House is sort of its own craziness and its own path, I think, one that I decided wasn't for me because I wanted to focus specifically on education. And oftentimes, if you're working in the House or working in the Senate, you're focused on a variety of issue areas. So I decided to pursue a career in education policy. So, and I feel like the term education policy I've tossed around a lot without really defining. So let me take a second to just say specifically what that is. And so education policy leverages existing research and sort of the history of education to advocate for changes that we should make to our education system. So it could happen on the federal level, on the state level, and on the local level. And so I decided to join an organization that was advocating for education priorities at the federal level. So what can we tell the federal government and the US Department of Education to do, right? What should we tell them to prioritize? What should we tell them to spend money on? And so that's where I am now at an organization called the Education Trust. And so day to day, some projects I work on. I work on an initiative around teacher diversity and equity. We have research that says that, more than 50% of the US student body is our students of color. Yet a really, really small percentage of our teaching workforce are teachers of color. And research shows that having a teacher of color really, really can positively impact students' experiences. So we are looking at the ratios of teachers of color to students of color in all 50 states. So that's one example of a project I'm working on. And we're reporting our findings to the Department of Education to sort of say, hey, we should allocate more resources, time, energy, and money to getting more teachers of color on the ground. And so I'm not out there doing sort of the collecting the data for the research. That's sort of something that I did at my previous role at SRI International. What I'm doing is saying, okay, we have this research that exists. How can we use it to advance equity? So that's where I am now.
Fantastic. I think a lot of really great tips that apply to anyone early career, just in terms of navigating grad school and that first job and continually reflecting on what you want to be doing and what these roles actually mean. And then, just a super interesting role right now, as everyone seems to agree. So also very timely. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. So let's start off with one that came through about mistakes and experiences. This is going back to Fulbright. Things you were unprepared for, mistakes you learned from throughout your Fulbright experience.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that one mistake I learned from is I came in a little bit guns a-blazing, right? Thinking about, I want to start this club or start this organization at my school, without really taking the time to think about community needs. And so, you know, I wanted to start like an English club where we just would hang out and practice English and talk about books and things like that. But my students weren't quite ready for that. That wasn't really the culture at the school. And so I think that one thing that I learned is sort of listening to stakeholders, right? And I think that this is something that has been really helpful, quite frankly, in job interviews, is saying, you know, how to listen to community needs, right? I talk to my students, talk to my teachers, say like, what would be interesting to you? A lot of them really liked sort of going out in nature and doing the more like physical activity stuff, which is how I got the idea for the caving camp. And so I think that being able to meet people where they are is a really important skill that I learned, and one that I definitely talked about in interviews. So I think that's one thing. And Michelle, if there's anything that you might want to add, please feel free. But
thanks, Sarah. I was also in Sarah's Malaysia cohort. I think that's a really key mistake and learning for me as well. That has also served me very well in my career to date. And just the sensitivity that can also be involved in learning about community needs. And particularly Sarah and I both worked on a lot of girls' leadership and empowerment work, and really making sure you're doing no harm. And I think that also extends to equity work, I'm sure, in your career, Sarah, in the US and in a lot of other areas. Also related to Malaysia, and I don't have a great answer about this one, but maybe you do, news sources that you paid attention to while we were there.
So I set up a Google alert for myself that was Malaysia, I think, and maybe education in Malaysia, which was really helpful because at 3:00 every day, I just got like the roundup of what was happening in Malaysia. And it was from a variety of sources, from like the New York Times to local Malaysian newspapers. So that's something that I would really suggest. I mean, I listened to the radio every day when I was there, which like was sort of silly, but was like a nice way, you know, the hosts often, thank you, Shannon, talked about what was going on in Malaysia. So that was really helpful. I don't think I have another great answer other than I also read some books, fiction and nonfiction, about Malaysia before I went there, which was also really helpful.
Perfect. Thank you. So I want to make sure everyone feels that they can jump in with a question if they have one. So please feel free to unmute yourself. We'll pause for a minute here, or keep sending questions in the chat box. But yeah, please feel free to jump in with questions about Malaysia, grad school, career, anything.
Yeah, and I'm happy to answer super technical questions about grad school too, because I know I had very specific ones like, do you take the GRE? So anything and everything is totally fine.
In the meantime, I would love to hear a bit of your reflections and takeaways on how the equity work you ended up doing in Malaysia and what you were learning parallels your work today, and any major differences as well.
Yeah, there are a lot of parallels between the equity work in Malaysia and what I did today. And I talked about those during my interviews at the Education Trust where I am now. You know, as I mentioned, schools are really, really sort of illuminate, I think, tensions and areas for growth in terms of racial equity work, both in the US and abroad. So I think not only interpersonally where I am now, navigating, you know, we're working in a time where race is at, I think, the forefront of and has a renewed interest from many in the US, has come into sharp focus. And I think being able to talk about your comfort level, right, with working with people from different socioeconomic status backgrounds, with people from different racial backgrounds, is really helpful. And also talking about, you know, when I was in the classroom, there were students who were paid attention to, and there were students who were not paid attention to, right, and who were sort of given up on. And school being the center of a community, and school being a way to not leave students behind was something that that we think about now, and that's something I was thinking about in Malaysia.
Thank you. Yeah, great questions from Meg. I'll just read them in case anyone doesn't have the chat open. What is advice you have for Fulbright alumni to get connected to organizations, nonprofit NGOs for work or career opportunities? And does Fulbright have an easy way to provide resources to alumni for these types of opportunities? I think questions every Fulbrighter has at some point.
Yeah. So I will be honest that I depended on the really good work of people who led our cohort in our Fulbright office to sort of set up those connections, which was really helpful. You know, people like Michelle, or we had another leader called named Raymond Chu, who was really, really wonderful, and sort of like taking a survey of alums and saying, where are you based? What's the field that you're in? Are you available for contact? And so I would say if that's not something that's happening in your cohort, to reach out or to take first steps at doing that, because it's something that's been really helpful to me. I'll also say that in grad school, particularly in, you know, because I was at an education grad school, there were a ton of folks who had completed a Fulbright. And so someone started sort of a group. We met up about once a month of just all the folks who had completed a Fulbright. And so again, that was really helpful. I don't think there was anyone who did a Fulbright who wasn't interested in doing that. And so if that's sort of not already existing, I would encourage you to maybe start that. In terms of other formal supports from Fulbright, Michelle, I don't know if you know of any. Don't.
Yeah, I think starting with your cohort is often the easiest place to start. And I do realize that some countries and cohorts are more active than others. I think this is an area that Fulbright as an institution has not done an amazing job at to date. And I know that there are a lot of initiatives in place and work happening to make this a stronger area of support. I think a lot of people feel very well supported pre-grant and during their grant, and then feel like you're kind of, that's the end of it. So the Fulbrighter social network that I think everyone should have access to is a way that that's starting to happen. There are a lot of subgroups. There's an education, they call them community, that people share jobs at, even just a way to broaden your own personal network and reach out to people. I found people quite receptive on that network. I have also seen this summer, quite recently, through the State Department for alumni who are US alumni. There are some more robust alumni resources, some webinars that are being put together, and they're trying to build out that infrastructure a bit. But I mean, back to Sarah's point, I think starting with your cohort, and then I would just encourage people to feel free to do some very creative LinkedIn searching. And I think Fulbright is a really strong connection, even if you were not in the same country or same program. I think reaching out to people and asking if they'd be willing to talk about their experience, I think you'll be surprised at the response rate that you would get.
Definitely.
And I know there are also, the Fulbright Alumni Association is somewhat separate from Fulbright, the program. It's a bit confusing, but the Alumni Association also has chapters. For example, they had a chapter in New York that I was part of, and it was more activity focused, but it was a really nice way to meet people from outside our cohort and in a very wide range of sectors. So there's not one place where all of these resources are gathered, maybe something for Fulbridge to do, but there are various outlets like that.
Yeah.
What else are people wondering about? Oh, thank you, Appraisal. Appraisal is wondering if you could share your thought process on deciding to change your path to education based on your BA in neuroscience. Do you have advice for people who have a non-education background?
It's a good question. I think, quite honestly, that people in education really sort of appreciate a diversity of backgrounds. And so I never felt like I was turned away from any opportunities because I hadn't studied it in undergrad. If anything, I think it was sort of helpful to me, because I think that, you know, in neuroscience, you have this, and in other fields, right, you can sort of take the skills that you do have and apply them to education. So I was sort of really interested in saying, you know, for example, I know how to read a research paper, or I know how to think about statistics, and it's something that's really helpful in education. So I think it hasn't quite been a barrier, the non-education background. I also think that Fulbright gave me exactly that piece of education that I needed as sort of a springboard into other parts of the education world. And so I think thinking about the skills that you do have from whatever your current focus is, thinking about the top 2 or 3 skills that you have from that field, and thinking about, you know, how could education benefit from this, is really, really helpful, and something that has certainly made people more excited, I think, to engage with me rather than less.
Thank you. And we're almost at time, so I want to give you all just a last chance for any burning questions. And then as you think about that, I will share a few wrap-up points. Relatedly, Sarah has offered to be available for anyone who might want to speak further. So I will send a wrap-up email probably tomorrow with just a quick summary, Sarah's contact information, as well as a feedback form. So really looking forward to hearing what other types of events you're interested in, other sectors, ways we can make this more useful, even more useful to Fulbrighters, particularly recently returned. And yes, as I mentioned at the beginning, if for some of you that weren't here, Fulbridge is a really wonderful way to get involved with the Fulbright community. It can be a bit more accessible than some of the more institutionalized Department of State run initiatives. Appraisal, I'll mention you since you're on the call. Appraisal's also involved on the engagement activities team. He's gathering information and interest in COVID-related research being done by Fulbrighters right now. So that's something that we'll be sharing over the coming months. But if anyone is interested in getting involved in Fulbridge in any capacity, whether as a speaker in this series or anything else, please feel free to reach out to me. You'll have my contact information. And if there are no other questions, I just want to say thank you to Sarah for giving us your time today. It's really generous. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Michelle, and Appraisal.
And yeah, thank you to everyone who joined. And yeah, all right. Hope everyone has a good rest of your Monday and look forward to getting your feedback. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.